The auction block stood in the center of Jamestown's dusty fairgrounds, and Florence Jenkins knew the exact moment her life stopped belonging to her, when the auctioneer grabbed her arm and forced her to climb those 3 wooden steps in front of 200 leering men. She had traveled west from Missouri 6 months ago with a man who promised marriage, a new life in California's gold country. But instead he had gambled away every cent they had and sold her contract of indenture to pay his debts before disappearing into the Sierra Nevada mountains like the coward he was. Now it was September of 1867, and she stood trembling in a worn calico dress while the auctioneer announced her like she was livestock, listing her age of 22, her ability to cook and sew, her literacy, her health, as if these things made her more valuable to the miners and ranchers who shouted crude remarks from the crowd. The bidding started at $50, and Florence felt her stomach turn as hands shot up around the fairgrounds. She recognized some of the men from town, the blacksmith with the wandering hands, the saloon owner who beat his previous housemaid so badly she fled in the night, the mining foreman who already had 3 women working his claim under conditions that made decent folk look away in shame. She fixed her eyes on the distant mountains, trying to disappear into herself, trying to pretend this was happening to someone else. 55, called a voice thick with whiskey. 60, countered another, and the crowd laughed. 75, said the blacksmith, and Florence's hands began to shake. Then a different voice cut through the chaos, calm and steady and unexpectedly firm. $200. The fairgrounds went silent. Florence's gaze snapped toward the voice and found a tall cowboy standing at the back of the crowd, his hat pulled low over his eyes, dust covering his leather chaps and worn boots. He looked like he had just ridden in from somewhere far away, and he held himself with a quiet confidence that made the other men step aside as he walked forward. 200? The auctioneer repeated, his eyebrows shooting up. Well now, that is quite the opening bid from a stranger. Anyone care to counter? The blacksmith scowled. 225. The cowboy did not hesitate. 400. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Florence stared at him, trying to understand what game he was playing, what cruel trick this might be. $400 was more than most men in Jamestown saw in half a year. It was an absurd amount for an indenture contract that most expected to go for under 100. The mining foreman stepped forward, his face red with anger. 450. 800, the cowboy said, and his voice carried a note of finality that made even the most determined bidders pause. The auctioneer looked around desperately, sensing profit but also sensing something else, something in the cowboy's bearing that suggested this was not a man to be trifled with. $800, that is the current bid. Do I hear 850? Anyone? This is your last chance, gentlemen. Silence hung over the fairgrounds like morning fog. The blacksmith shook his head and turned away. The mining foreman spat into the dirt, but made no counteroffer. The saloon owner studied the cowboy with narrowed eyes, then apparently thought better of whatever he was considering, and backed into the crowd. Sold! The auctioneer cried, bringing his gavel down with a sharp crack. Sold to the gentleman in the back for $800. Sir, if you will come forward to complete the transaction. Florence's legs nearly gave out beneath her. She watched the cowboy approach, tall and lean, with broad shoulders and a weathered face that suggested he spent most of his life under open sky. When he reached the auction block, he pulled a thick roll of bills from inside his vest and counted out the money with practiced efficiency, handing it to the auctioneer without a word. The auctioneer examined each bill carefully, then produced the indenture papers and held them out. The cowboy took the papers, glanced at them briefly, then did something Florence never expected. He tore them in half, then in half again, letting the pieces flutter to the ground like autumn leaves. "What are you doing?" the auctioneer sputtered. "Those are legal documents." "We're legal documents," the cowboy corrected. He turned to Florence, and she finally saw his face clearly beneath the brim of his hat. He had gray eyes that reminded her of storm clouds, a strong jaw shadowed with several days of stubble, and a scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone. He looked to be perhaps 28 or 29, with the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from hard work and harder living. "Madam," he said quietly, "you are free to go wherever you please. I have no claim on you, and no man here does either." Florence could not speak. She stared at him, then at the torn papers on the ground, then back at him. "I do not understand." "Nothing to understand. I just paid off your contract and nullified it. You are a free woman." He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. "I am sorry you were put through this indignity. No one should be sold like cattle." Before she could respond, the mining foreman pushed through the crowd, his face twisted with rage. "Now, hold on just a minute. You cannot just tear up a legal contract. That woman owes labor, and if you do not want her services, I will buy the contract from you." The cowboy turned slowly, and something in his movement made the mining foreman take a step back. "The contract no longer exists. The lady is free. That is the end of the discussion." "The hell it is," the foreman growled. "I know your type, riding in here playing the hero. Probably planning to take her for yourself once you get out of town. Well, I paid good money to have first refusal on any contracts sold today, and I am not letting some drifter come in and ruin my investment." The cowboy's expression did not change, but Florence saw his hand move almost imperceptibly closer to the revolver on his hip. "You need to walk away now." "Like hell I will." The foreman reached for Florence's arm, but before he could touch her, the cowboy moved with startling speed, stepping between them and catching the foreman's wrist in an iron grip. "Do not," the cowboy said, his voice deadly quiet. "Do not touch her. Do not speak to her. Do not look at her. Walk away while you still can." The foreman tried to pull free, but the cowboy's grip did not budge. For a long moment, they stood locked in silent confrontation, while the crowd watched with bated breath. Then the foreman seemed to see something in the cowboy's eyes that convinced him, and he wrenched his arm away with a curse. "This is not over," he spat. "Yes," the cowboy said, "it is." The foreman stalked away, shoving through the crowd, and the other men seemed to sense that the entertainment was over. They began to disperse, casting curious glances back at Florence and the cowboy, but apparently unwilling to challenge him further. Within minutes, the fairgrounds had mostly cleared, leaving just the two of them standing by the auction block as the afternoon sun beat down relentlessly. Florence found her voice at last. "Why did you do that? $800 is a fortune." The cowboy shrugged, looking uncomfortable with the question. "It was the right thing to do. But you do not even know me. I could be a terrible person. I could be a thief or a liar or worse." "Are you?" "No, but you had no way of knowing that." He almost smiled then, just a slight quirk at the corner of his mouth. "I am generally a good judge of character. Besides, I have seen men sell horses with more dignity than that auctioneer was selling you. It did not sit right." He glanced toward the mountains. "Do you have anywhere to go? Family? Friends?" Florence shook her head, fighting back the tears that suddenly threatened to overwhelm her. "No. I came west with a man who promised to marry me, but he sold my contract instead and ran off. I have no one." The cowboy was quiet for a moment, then seemed to make a decision. "I have a ranch about 20 miles north of here, up in the foothills. It is not much, just a small operation with cattle and horses, but I have a spare room, and I could use help with cooking and general work around the place. I would pay you fair wages, and you would be free to leave whenever you wanted. No contract, just honest work for honest pay." Florence studied him carefully, looking for any sign of deception or ulterior motive, but she saw only sincerity in those gray eyes. Still, she had been fooled before by a man who seemed kind and honorable. "And what would you expect from me, besides cooking and housework?" He understood her meaning immediately and shook his head. "Nothing improper, madam. I give you my word. You would have your own room with a lock on the door, and I would treat you with respect. If I ever made you uncomfortable, you could leave immediately, and I would give you enough money to get somewhere safe." "Why would you do all this for a stranger?" The cowboy looked away toward the mountains again, and something sad crossed his features. "Let us just say I know what it is like to be alone in the world with no one to help. I would not wish that on anyone." He met her eyes again. "My name is Franklin Zander, by the way. Most folks call me Frank." "Florence Jenkins," she said softly. "Most folks call me Flora." "Well, Flora, what do you say? I have supplies to pick up in town, and then I will be heading back to the ranch. You are welcome to come along, or, if you would rather, I can give you some money and you can make your own way. The choice is entirely yours." Flora looked around at the dusty fairgrounds, at the town of Jamestown, beyond with its rough saloons and rougher men, at the mountains that promised freedom but also hardship for a woman alone with no resources. Then she looked at Frank, at his honest face and steady presence, and made a decision that was part desperation and part intuition. "I will come to your ranch," she said, "at least for a while, until I can figure out what to do next." Frank nodded. "Fair enough. Let me get my horse and we will head into town for those supplies. Stay close to me. Some of those men might get ideas about causing trouble." He was right to be cautious. As they walked through Jamestown's main street toward the general store, Flora felt hostile eyes tracking their progress. The mining foreman stood outside the Silver Dollar Saloon with a group of his men, glaring at them with undisguised hatred. The blacksmith watched from his forge, his massive arms crossed over his chest. Even the townsfolk who had not attended the auction seemed to sense something had happened and studied them with curiosity. Frank kept Flora close, his hand resting casually on his revolver, in a clear warning to anyone thinking of starting trouble. They entered the general store, and the proprietor, a thin man with spectacles and nervous hands, greeted Frank with obvious relief. "Mr. Zander, I have your order ready. Flour, salt, coffee, beans, bacon, and the ammunition you requested." He cast a curious glance at Flora. "I heard what you did at the auction. That was a mighty generous thing." "It was the right thing," Frank said simply. He paid for the supplies and loaded them into a large burlap sack, slinging it over his shoulder with ease. "I need one more thing, Charlie. A good coat for the lady. Nights get cold up in the foothills." The proprietor nodded and pulled out a sturdy wool coat in dark blue. Flora started to protest, but Frank silenced her with a look and paid for the coat without discussion. He handed it to her with the same casual respect he had shown since the auction, and she found herself grateful beyond words. They left the store and walked to where Frank's horse was tied outside the livery stable. The animal was a beautiful bay gelding with intelligent eyes and a calm temperament, clearly well cared for. Frank secured the supplies behind the saddle, then turned to Flora. "You can ride up with me. It is not too far, and Copper here is strong enough to carry us both." Flora had not ridden a horse since she was a girl back in Missouri, but she nodded and let Frank help her up into the saddle. He swung up behind her with practiced ease, and she found herself acutely aware of his presence, of his arms reaching around her to hold the reins, of the warmth of his body against her back. It was not unpleasant, just unfamiliar after months of keeping her guard up around every man she encountered. They rode out of Jamestown as the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The trail led north into the foothills, through stands of pine and oak, past meadows where deer grazed in the fading light. Frank did not talk much, but the silence between them was comfortable rather than awkward. Flora let herself relax slightly, breathing in the clean mountain air and feeling the tension of the last 6 months begin to loosen its grip on her shoulders. "How long have you had your ranch?" she asked after a while. "About 3 years. I worked as a cowhand after the war, saved up enough to buy the land and start my own operation. It is not much compared to the big spreads down in the valley, but it is mine, and it is honest work." "You fought in the war?" "Yes, madam. Union cavalry. Enlisted when I was 18, mustered out in 65. He said it matter-of-factly, without pride or shame, just stating a fact of his history. "That must have been hard." "It was, but I survived, which is more than a lot of good men can say." He was quiet for a moment. "What about you? What brought you west?" Flora hesitated, then decided he deserved honesty after what he had done for her. "I worked in a dress shop in St. Louis. My parents died of cholera when I was 19, and I had no other family. A man named Marcus came into the shop one day, all charm and promises. Said he was heading to California to seek his fortune. Said he wanted a wife to build a life with. I was lonely and foolish, and I believed him." She swallowed hard. "We got as far as Jamestown before he showed his true colors. Turned out he was a gambler and a drunk. And when he lost everything at cards, he sold my contract to cover his debts. I have not seen him since." Frank's arms tightened slightly around her, and she heard the anger in his voice when he spoke. "That is despicable. A man who would do that is no man at all. I should have known better. The signs were there, but I did not want to see them. You trusted someone who presented himself as trustworthy. That is not a failing on your part. That is a failing on his." Frank guided Copper around a fallen log. "For what it is worth, I think you are brave for coming west at all. A lot of people talk about new beginnings, but few have the courage to actually try." His words warmed her more than the coat he had bought her. They rode on as twilight deepened into night, and Flora found herself fighting sleep, lulled by the steady rhythm of Copper's gait and the security of Frank's solid presence behind her. She must have dozed, because the next thing she knew, Frank was saying her name softly. "Flora, we are here." She opened her eyes and saw a small ranch house silhouetted against the star-filled sky. It was a simple structure of wood and stone, with a covered porch and a stone chimney. Nearby stood a barn, a corral with several horses, and what looked like a chicken coop. In the distance, she could hear the lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through pine trees. Frank dismounted and helped her down, then led Copper to the barn. "Let me take care of the horse and get these supplies put away. You go on inside. The door is unlocked. I will be in shortly and get a fire going." Flora walked to the house on unsteady legs, her body stiff from the ride. The front door opened easily, and she stepped into darkness that smelled of wood smoke and leather and coffee. She stood just inside, uncertain, until Frank came in behind her with a lantern. The light revealed a main room with a stone fireplace, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a settee that had seen better days, and shelves lined with books. Everything was neat and clean, surprisingly so for a bachelor, but there was a stark quality to it, as if the person who lived here did not think much about comfort or decoration. "The spare room is through there," Frank said, pointing to a door on the left side of the room. "It has a bed and a dresser, not much else, but it is clean. The necessary is out back about 30 yards. There is a basin and pitcher in your room for washing up." He moved to the fireplace and began building a fire with efficient movements. "Are you hungry? I can make something simple." "I can cook," Flora offered, "if you show me where things are." "You have had a long day. Let me handle it tonight. Tomorrow you can take over kitchen duties if you want." He had the fire going now, flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. "There is bacon and beans, or I can make Johnny cakes if you prefer." "Anything is fine. I am more tired than hungry." Frank nodded and moved to the small kitchen area, pulling out a cast-iron skillet and ingredients. Flora watched him work, noting the practiced way he prepared the simple meal, and found herself reassessing her initial impression. This was not a man who was helpless without a woman around. This was a man who had learned to take care of himself, and did not need someone to cook and clean for him, which made his offer of employment all the more generous and all the more puzzling. They ate in companionable silence, just bacon and beans and strong coffee. But it was the best meal Flora had tasted in months. When they finished, Frank showed her to the spare room, which was indeed simple but clean, with a narrow bed covered in a patchwork quilt, a dresser, and a chair. A small window looked out over the dark hills. "The door has a lock on the inside, like I promised," Frank said, showing her the bolt. "I will be up early to tend the livestock, but you sleep as late as you need. You have been through an ordeal, and you need rest." He paused in the doorway. "Flora, I want you to know you are safe here. I meant what I said about treating you with respect. If I ever make you uncomfortable, you tell me immediately." "I will," she said softly. "And Frank, thank you. For everything. I know I have said it before, but I do not think I can say it enough. You saved my life today." He looked uncomfortable with the gratitude. "I just did what any decent person would do. Sleep well, Flora." He closed the door, and Flora listened to his footsteps retreat across the main room. She heard another door open and close, then silence. For the first time in months, she was alone in a room with a locked door, and no fear of someone forcing their way in. She sat on the edge of the bed and finally let the tears come, crying for everything she had lost and everything she had endured, and the unexpected kindness of a stranger who asked for nothing in return. The next morning, Flora woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the sound of someone chopping wood outside. She washed her face in the basin, braided her hair, and emerged from her room to find the main room empty, but the fire already burning and a pot of coffee warming on the hearth. She poured herself a cup and stood at the window, watching Frank split logs with powerful, efficient swings of the axe. He had shed his vest and rolled up his sleeves, and Flora found herself noticing the lean strength in his arms, the fluid way he moved, the concentration on his face. There was something compelling about watching a man do honest work well, something that made her feel things she thought Marcus had killed in her. She pushed the thought away and set about exploring the kitchen. Frank had not been exaggerating about needing help. While everything was clean and organized, his supplies were basic to the point of Spartan. She found flour, salt, sugar, baking powder, lard, and the supplies he had bought yesterday. In the root cellar, she discovered potatoes, onions, and some withered apples. Not much to work with, but she had made do with less. By the time Frank came inside, she had biscuits in the oven and bacon frying in the skillet. He stopped in the doorway, surprise crossing his features. "You did not have to do that. I said you could rest." "I rested," Flora said. "Now I'm working. You hired me to cook, so let me cook." "I did not hire you because I needed a cook. I hired you because you needed help. Maybe I need to feel useful more than I need to feel rescued." The words came out sharper than she intended, and she saw him flinch slightly. She softened her tone. "I appreciate everything you have done, Frank, more than you know. But I spent 6 months being helpless and dependent on Marcus, and then I spent time as property to be sold. I need to do something, to have a purpose, even if it is just making breakfast." Frank considered this, then nodded slowly. "I understand, and for what it is worth, those biscuits smell better than anything I have cooked in 3 years." They fell into an easy routine over the following days. Frank worked the ranch from dawn to dusk, tending his small herd of cattle, maintaining fences, training horses, and doing the 100 other tasks that kept a small operation running. Flora took over the cooking and cleaning, but she also found herself helping with other work, feeding the chickens, gathering eggs, tending the small vegetable garden that had been mostly neglected, even helping Frank with some of the horses. She discovered he had a gift with animals, a patient gentleness that brought out the best in even the most difficult horses. He could spend hours working with a skittish mare, his voice low and soothing, his movements calm and predictable, until the animal learned to trust him. Watching him work, Flora understood that this was a man who had seen enough violence and chaos in the war and wanted only peace and honesty in his life. They talked as they worked, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes for the future. Flora learned that Frank had grown up on a farm in Ohio, that he had a younger sister who had married and moved to Oregon, that his parents had both died while he was away at war. He had come west looking for a fresh start, a place where he could build something of his own without the weight of memory bearing down on him. In turn, she told him about growing up in Missouri, about her love of reading and her skill with a needle, about the dress shop where she had worked and the small dreams she had harbored of someday owning her own establishment. She told him about the loneliness that had made her vulnerable to Marcus's lies, and Frank listened without judgment, his gray eyes understanding. 3 weeks passed in this manner, and Flora felt something shifting inside her, like ice beginning to thaw after a long winter. She caught herself smiling more, laughing at Frank's dry observations about his stubborn cattle or difficult horses. She found herself looking forward to mealtimes, to the quiet conversations over coffee, to the comfortable silence that often settled between them in the evenings when they sat by the fire, Flora mending clothes while Frank cleaned his tack or read from one of his well-worn books. She also found herself noticing things about him that had nothing to do with gratitude. The way his eyes crinkled when he almost smiled, the strength in his hands and the gentleness with which he used that strength, the sound of his voice in the morning, rough with sleep, calling out a greeting as he headed to the barn, the way he always made sure she had the more comfortable chair by the fire, the better portion of meat at dinner, the last cup of coffee in the pot. It frightened her, these feelings. She had trusted a man before and paid dearly for it. She had promised herself she would never be that foolish again. But Frank was nothing like Marcus. Where Marcus had been all charm and empty promises, Frank was quiet integrity. Where Marcus had demanded and taken, Frank gave without expectation of return. Where Marcus had lied, Frank was honest to the point of bluntness. Still, she kept her feelings to herself, afraid of misreading the situation, afraid of ruining the peace they had found together. Then, one afternoon, everything changed. Flora was in the garden pulling weeds when she heard horses approaching. She looked up to see 3 men riding toward the house, and her heart sank when she recognized the mining foreman from the auction, flanked by 2 rough-looking men she did not know. Frank emerged from the barn, his hand moving instinctively to his revolver. "You are not welcome here. Turn around and leave." The foreman reined in his horse and leaned forward in the saddle, his smile nasty. "Now, is that any way to greet visitors? We just came to have a friendly conversation." "We have nothing to talk about. The lady is a free woman and under my protection. That is all you need to know." "See, that is where you are wrong." The foreman pulled a piece of paper from his vest. I did some checking with the territorial authorities. Turns out you cannot just tear up an indenture contract. It has to be officially nullified by a judge, and since that never happened, the contract is still legally binding, which means the lady still owes labor, and since you destroyed the physical contract, that makes you liable for the debt. Frank's expression did not change, but Flora saw his jaw tighten. That paper you are holding is not worth the ink it is printed on. Maybe, maybe not, but I am willing to bet a judge will see things differently. So here is my offer. You give me the woman, and I will forget about pursuing legal action. You keep her, and I will make your life hell. I have got friends in the territorial government, and I can tie you up in court for years, cost you everything you have got. Get off my land. The foreman's smile vanished. You are making a mistake. I always get what I want, one way or another. Last warning. Leave now, or I will make you leave. One of the other men, a burly fellow with a scarred face, laughed. You against 3 of us? I would like to see you try. What happened next occurred so fast Flora almost missed it. Frank's revolver cleared leather with startling speed, and suddenly all 3 men were staring down the barrel of his Colt .45. His hand was rock steady, his face calm, but there was something in his eyes that made the burly man's laughter die in his throat. I served 4 years in the cavalry, Frank said quietly. I fought at Shiloh, Stones River, and Chickamauga. I watched better men than you die screaming in the mud, and I killed more men than I care to remember. I came out here to leave that behind, to build a peaceful life, but do not mistake my desire for peace with inability to fight. Now, you have 3 seconds to turn those horses around before I put a bullet in each of your animals and leave you to walk back to town. 1. The foreman's face went pale. 2. This is not over, the foreman spat, but he was already turning his horse. 3. The 3 men rode off at a gallop, and Frank watched them until they disappeared from sight before holstering his revolver. His hand was shaking slightly when he lowered it, and Flora realized the calm demeanor had been a mask over deep tension. She walked over to him. Are you all right? I am fine, just angry that they came here, that they threatened you. He turned to her, and she saw genuine worry in his eyes. Flora, I am sorry. I thought tearing up that contract would be enough, but apparently it is more complicated than that. I should have taken you to a judge first thing, made sure it was done properly. This is not your fault. You have already done more for me than anyone had a right to expect. Maybe, but I am not going to let that man take you. We will go to Sacramento if we have to. Get this settled legally once and for all. He ran a hand through his hair. I should have killed him. Would have saved us a lot of trouble. Flora touched his arm without thinking, and they both froze at the contact. Do not say that. You are not that person anymore. You said you came here for peace, and I will not let you throw that away because of me. Frank looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. And something passed between them, something that made Flora's heart beat faster and her breath catch in her throat. For a moment, she thought he might say something, might acknowledge this thing that had been growing between them for weeks now. But then he stepped back, breaking the contact, and the moment passed. We should probably head to Sacramento tomorrow, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Get this resolved before he causes more trouble. Flora nodded, trying to ignore the disappointment that washed through her. Whatever you think is best. That night, Flora lay awake in her room, listening to the wind in the pines and thinking about everything that had happened. She thought about the foreman's threats, about the legal complications she had not understood, about the long ride to Sacramento that awaited them. But mostly she thought about that moment in the yard, about the feel of Frank's arm under her hand, about the way he had looked at her before stepping away. She had fallen in love with him. The realization should have terrified her, but instead it felt right, inevitable, like something that had been building since the moment he tore up her contract at the auction. She loved his quiet strength, his unshakable integrity, his dry humor and gentle hands. She loved the way he treated her like a person rather than property, the way he respected her choices, the way he made her feel safe for the first time in longer than she could remember. But did he feel the same way? He was kind to her, protective, but those things could spring from decency rather than deeper emotion. He had never touched her beyond what was necessary, never looked at her with anything other than respect, never suggested that their arrangement might become something more. Maybe she was just a responsibility to him, a wrong he had righted, someone he would help but never truly want. The thought hurt more than she expected, and she turned her face into the pillow, fighting back tears. She had been through so much, survived so much, and now she had to survive this too, loving a man who might never love her back. In the other room, Frank sat by the dying fire and stared into the embers. He had not been entirely honest with Flora about why he had bid on her contract. Yes, it had been the right thing to do. Yes, it had offended his sense of decency to see a woman sold like livestock. But there had been another reason, one he had not wanted to examine too closely. From the moment he saw her standing on that auction block, her chin raised in defiance even as her hands trembled, he had felt something shift in his chest. She had looked so alone, so determined not to break, and he had seen in her something he recognized in himself. A survivor. Someone who had been knocked down by life but refused to stay down. Someone who deserved better than what fate had handed them. He had told himself he was just helping someone in need, just doing what any decent man would do. But as the weeks passed and he got to know her, he had been forced to admit the truth. He was falling in love with Florence Jenkins. He loved her strength and resilience. He loved the way she sang while she cooked, unconsciously beautiful melodies from her childhood. He loved her sharp wit, and the way she called him on his nonsense. He loved the sound of her laughter, rare but genuine, and the way she had brought warmth and life to his lonely house. He loved the graceful way she moved, the intelligence in her eyes, the compassion she showed even to the most ornery of his animals. But he could not tell her any of this. She had been betrayed and sold by a man she trusted, had been through an ordeal that would have broken a weaker person. The last thing she needed was another man making demands on her, expecting things from her, complicating her life when she was still trying to put it back together. She needed time and space to heal, to figure out who she was and what she wanted, and he would not interfere with that, no matter how much he wanted to. So he would take her to Sacramento, get her contract legally nullified, and then he would help her find her own path, even if that path led away from him. It would hurt, but her freedom and happiness mattered more than his feelings. He threw the last log on the fire and went to bed, but sleep was a long time coming. They set out for Sacramento 2 days later, Frank having spent the intervening time arranging for a neighbor to watch the ranch in their absence. The journey would take several days by horseback, and Frank had packed supplies accordingly. They rode in comfortable silence for the most part, though occasionally Flora would point out something that caught her interest. A hawk circling overhead, wildflowers blooming in an unexpected riot of color, the play of light on distant hills. On the third day, they stopped to make camp by a small stream as evening approached. Frank tended to the horses, while Flora gathered firewood and set about making dinner. They worked with the easy coordination they had developed over the past weeks, each anticipating what the other needed without discussion. As they ate, Frank said, "I have been thinking about what you will do after we get your contract nullified." Flora looked up from her plate, her heart sinking. This was it then. He was planning to send her on her way. "What do you mean?" "Well, you are a skilled seamstress, right? And you know the dress trade. Sacramento is a growing city. Lots of people with money from the gold fields. Seems like it might be a good place for you to set up your own shop, like you talked about wanting to do." "You want me to leave?" She said it flatly, trying to keep the hurt out of her voice. Frank looked confused. "I want you to have the life you deserve, the dreams you had before Marcus ruined everything. You are talented and smart, Flora. You could build something real in Sacramento. And what if I do not want to live in Sacramento? What if I am happy where I am? On my ranch, cooking for a cowboy in the middle of nowhere, you can do better than that." "Better than what? Better than being treated with respect? Better than honest work? Better than—" She stopped herself before she said too much. "Then what?" Frank pressed. "Better than living somewhere I actually want to be with someone I actually want to be with," she finished, then immediately regretted her honesty when she saw the shock on his face. "Flora, you do not know what you are saying. You have been through an ordeal, and I helped you, and now you are confusing gratitude with something else." "Do not tell me what I am feeling," she said, anger rising now. "I know the difference between gratitude and love, Frank. I may have been foolish once, but I am not stupid." Frank stood abruptly and walked to the edge of the stream, his back to her. "You should not love me. You deserve someone better, someone who has not done the things I have done, someone who can give you a real life." Flora followed him, unwilling to let this go now that the truth was out. "What are you talking about? You are one of the best men I have ever known. You do not know that. You do not know what I did in the war, the orders I followed, the things I saw and did and cannot forget, no matter how hard I try." His voice was rough with emotion. "I came out here to get away from all that, to build something clean and simple, but the past does not let go so easily. Some nights I wake up seeing the faces of men I killed, boys really, younger than me, and I wonder if I even deserve peace after what I have done." Flora moved to stand in front of him, forcing him to look at her. "The war made everyone do terrible things. That does not define who you are now. I see who you are, Frank. I see your kindness and your integrity, and the gentle way you treat everything around you. I see a man who spent a fortune he probably could not afford to save a stranger, who asks for nothing in return, who treats me like I matter. That is who you are. I want you to have choices, Flora. I do not want you to feel obligated to stay with me because I helped you. Then stop trying to send me away and let me choose." She grabbed his hands, holding tight when he tried to pull away. "I am choosing you, Frank. I am choosing your ranch and your horses and your terrible coffee. I am choosing the life we have been building together for the past month. I am choosing you because I love you, not because I owe you, not because I am confused, but because you are the first man who has ever made me feel safe and valued and seen." Frank stared at her, conflict warring in his eyes. "I do not want to take advantage of you. You are not. I am a grown woman making a free choice. For the first time in my life, I actually have a free choice, and I am choosing this. I am choosing us. Unless—" She faltered, suddenly uncertain. "Unless you do not feel the same way, and this is your way of trying to let me down gently. Not feel the same way?" Frank laughed, a broken sound. "Flora, I have been in love with you since the day I watched you stand on that auction block, refusing to cry in front of those animals. I have spent every day since trying not to show it, because I did not want to pressure you or make you uncomfortable. I have lain awake every night wanting to go to you, to tell you how I feel, and forcing myself to stay away because I thought it was what you needed." Flora felt tears spring to her eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. "You are an idiot, Franklin Xander. I know. A noble, wonderful, infuriating idiot. I know that too. So are you going to kiss me, or are we going to stand here all night being idiots together?" Frank smiled then, really smiled, and it transformed his face. "Well, since you asked so nicely." He kissed her gently at first, tentative, giving her every opportunity to change her mind. But Flora had never been more certain of anything in her life. She wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with all the emotion she had been holding in for weeks, and Frank pulled her closer, deepening the kiss, one hand tangling in her hair, while the other pressed against the small of her back. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Frank rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Flora. God help me. I love you so much." "I love you too," she whispered. "I love you too." They stood there by the stream as the stars came out overhead, holding each other, and Flora felt something settle in her chest, something warm and right and permanent. She had come west looking for a new life, had been betrayed and sold and broken down, but somehow she had found her way to this man, this moment, this love. "We should still go to Sacramento," Frank said eventually. "Get your contract nullified properly so that Foreman cannot cause any more trouble." "Agreed, but after that, we go home." "Home," Frank repeated and smiled. "I like the sound of that." They reached Sacramento 5 days later and went directly to the territorial courthouse. The judge who heard their case was a practical man in his 50s who listened to their story, examined the evidence, and declared the original indenture contract void and unenforceable within 20 minutes. He gave Flora official papers certifying her free status and warned Frank that the mining foreman might try to cause trouble anyway. "Men like that do not like being thwarted," the judge said. "You watch your back, son." "I will, Your Honor. Thank you." They spent one night in Sacramento at a modest hotel, in separate rooms, despite the proprietor's assumption that they were married. Flora appreciated that Frank did not push for more than she was ready to give. Even though they had declared their love, he was content to court her properly, to take things slowly, to let their relationship develop naturally. The ride back to the ranch felt different than the ride out. There was a lightness between them now, an openness that made conversation flow easily. They talked about the future, about their plans for the ranch, about Flora's idea to take in sewing work from the neighboring ranches to supplement their income. They talked about trivial things and serious things and everything in between, learning each other's minds as they had already learned each other's hearts. When they finally rode up to the ranch house a week after leaving Sacramento, Flora felt a sense of homecoming that had nothing to do with the building itself and everything to do with the man beside her. This was where she belonged, where she wanted to build a life. The neighbor who had been watching the place reported that everything had been quiet, though he mentioned seeing some strangers riding through the area a few days back. Frank thanked him and sent him home with a portion of the supplies they had bought in Sacramento. That evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sun set over the hills, Frank said, "Flora, there is something I want to ask you, but I do not want you to feel rushed or pressured." "What is it?" "Marry me?" He said it simply, directly, his gray eyes steady on hers. "I know we have not been courting long by conventional standards, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to build this ranch into something we can be proud of together. I want children with you, a family, a real life, but only if that is what you want too. I will not pressure you, and if you need more time, I will wait as long as you need." Flora felt her heart swell with emotion. This was nothing like Marcus's smooth proposals and empty promises. This was honest and awkward and completely genuine, and she loved Frank even more for it. "Yes," she said softly. "Yes, I will marry you." Frank's face lit up with joy, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "I will make you happy, Flora. I swear I will spend every day trying to make you happy." "You already do," she whispered. They married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony in Jamestown's small church. Frank's neighbor stood up as his best man, and the preacher's wife served as Flora's witness. Flora wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric. Frank bought her in town, simple blue cotton that brought out her eyes. Frank wore his best shirt and vest, his hair neatly combed, looking nervous and happy in equal measure. The ceremony was brief, the words familiar and meaningful. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Frank kissed her with a gentleness that made Flora's eyes sting with tears. They were married. After everything she had been through, all the hardship and heartbreak, she had found this good man, and he had chosen her, and she had chosen him, and they were building a life together. The wedding night was gentle and sweet, Frank patient with Flora's nervousness, taking his time, making sure she felt safe and cherished. Afterward, they lay tangled together in Frank's bed, which was now their bed, and Flora felt a sense of completeness she had never experienced before. "I love you, Mrs. Zander," Frank murmured against her hair. "I love you too, Mr. Zander," she replied, and fell asleep in his arms, feeling like the luckiest woman alive. The months that followed were the happiest of Flora's life. She and Frank worked the ranch together, their partnership growing stronger every day. She took in sewing work from the neighboring ranches, using her skills to earn extra money that they saved toward expanding their herd. Frank taught her to ride properly, and soon she was able to help him move cattle and mend fences and do all the tasks that kept a ranch running. They talked about everything under the sun, sharing their thoughts and dreams and fears with an honesty that deepened their bond. They laughed together over small things, silly mistakes, and stubborn animals, and the 1,000 little absurdities of daily life. They made love with increasing passion and joy, learning each other's bodies as they had learned each other's hearts. In the spring of 1868, Flora discovered she was pregnant. She told Frank over breakfast, nervous about how he would react. But he simply set down his coffee cup, walked around the table, and swept her into his arms, laughing with pure joy. "We are going to have a baby," he said wonderingly. "Flora, we are going to have a baby. You are happy? Happy? I am the happiest man in California, in the world." He kissed her soundly. "We need to get the spare room ready, and I should build a cradle, and we need to make sure you are not working too hard. You should rest more. Frank, I am pregnant, not dying. I can still work." "I know, but I want to take care of you. Let me take care of you." Flora smiled and kissed him. "All right, you can take care of me, but I'm still doing my share of the work. This baby needs to know its mother is strong." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and as Flora's belly grew, so did their excitement. Frank became even more protective, always worrying that she was doing too much, lifting too much, working too hard. Flora found it endearing even when it was exasperating. In November of 1868, their son was born after a long labor that left Frank pacing the floor in terror, while the midwife from town helped Flora through the delivery. When he finally heard the baby's first cry, Frank rushed into the bedroom and fell to his knees beside the bed, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his wife and child. "He is perfect," Flora whispered, exhausted but radiant. "Frank, we made a perfect baby." "You are amazing," Frank said, kissing her forehead. "You are the strongest, most amazing woman I have ever known." They named their son James Franklin Zander, and from the moment he drew breath, he had his parents wrapped around his tiny fingers. Frank was a devoted father, getting up in the night to bring the baby to Flora for feeding, changing diapers without complaint, singing lullabies in his rough voice that somehow always soothed James when he was fussy. Flora watched her husband with their son and fell in love with him all over again. This was the life she had dreamed of but never thought she would have: a loving husband, a beautiful child, a home of their own. When James was 6 months old, Flora discovered she was pregnant again. This time, Frank's reaction was more measured, concerned about how hard another pregnancy and birth would be on Flora, but she reassured him that she wanted a large family, wanted their children to have siblings the way she and Frank had never had. Their daughter, Sarah, was born in the summer of 1870, a tiny thing with Flora's dark hair and Frank's gray eyes. James, now a toddler, was fascinated by his baby sister and wanted to help with everything. Flora spent her days in happy chaos, managing the household, tending the children, still taking in sewing when she had time, while Frank worked the ranch and helped with the children whenever he was near the house. They added to the ranch gradually, buying more cattle when they could afford it, breeding Frank's horses and selling the colts for good money. They built the addition onto the house to accommodate their growing family, adding a proper bedroom for the children and expanding the kitchen. They hired a young man from town to help with the ranch work, which allowed Frank more time with his family. One evening, when Sarah was 2 and James was 4, they all sat on the porch watching the sunset. James was playing with a wooden horse Frank had carved for him, while Sarah dozed in Flora's arms. Frank had his arm around Flora's shoulders, and she leaned into his warmth, feeling utterly content. "Do you remember the day we met?" Flora asked. "Every detail," Frank said. "You were standing on that auction block looking like you wanted to set the whole fairground on fire with your eyes. I was terrified. You did not show it. You looked fierce. I felt like my life was ending, and then you appeared and tore up that contract, and everything changed." Frank kissed the top of her head. "Best $800 I ever spent. Do you ever regret it? Regret me?" He pulled back to look at her, his expression serious. "Flora, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. You and these children are the reason I get up in the morning, the reason I work so hard, the reason I am glad I survived the war. I have never regretted you for a single second." Flora blinked back tears. Even after all this time, he could still move her with his honest declarations. "I love you, Frank Zander. I love you too, Flora Zander. Always." As the years passed, their family continued to grow. Flora gave birth to another son, David, in 1872, and then twin girls, Emma and Elizabeth, in 1874. The house was always full of noise and laughter, and the controlled chaos of raising 5 children on a working ranch. James grew into a serious boy who loved working with his father and the horses. Sarah was the dreamer of the family, always making up stories and singing songs. David was the adventurer, constantly getting into mischief and giving his parents gray hairs with his daring exploits. Emma was quiet and thoughtful, while Elizabeth was outgoing and bold. Frank proved to be a wonderful father, patient and loving, but firm when necessary. He taught his children to ride and rope, to respect animals and nature, to be honest and kind and strong. He told them stories of his time in the cavalry, carefully edited for young ears, and taught them that strength was not just physical but moral, that the hardest battles were often the ones fought within oneself. Flora ran the household with efficient grace, teaching her daughters to sew and cook, instilling in all her children a love of learning through the books she ordered from Sacramento. She expanded her sewing business, eventually employing 2 young women from town to help with the work, providing them with fair wages and honest employment. The ranch prospered under Frank's careful management. He developed a reputation for raising quality horses, and buyers came from as far as San Francisco to purchase his animals. The cattle herd grew steadily, and by 1875, the Zander Ranch was one of the most successful small operations in the region. They never forgot where they had come from, or how close Flora had come to a very different life. Every year on the anniversary of the auction, they made a donation to help women in difficult circumstances, funding a home in Sacramento for women escaping bad situations. It was their way of paying forward the luck and grace that had brought them together. One afternoon in the spring of 1876, Flora was working in the garden when a rider approached the ranch. She looked up and felt her blood run cold when she recognized the mining foreman who had tried to claim her all those years ago. He looked older and meaner, and he rode with the bearing of a man who had come to cause trouble. Frank emerged from the barn, saw the rider, and immediately positioned himself between the man and Flora. "You are not welcome here. Leave now." The foreman reined in his horse and smirked. "Relax, cowboy. I am not here to cause trouble. I am leaving California, heading back east, and I wanted to stop by before I go." "Why?" "To tell you that you were right." The foreman's smirk faded. "I spent the last 9 years trying to get revenge on you, trying to ruin you, and all it did was ruin me. Lost my mind, lost my money, lost everything chasing a grudge. I am a broken man heading home to die, and I wanted you to know that you won." Frank studied him for a long moment. "I was never trying to win anything. I was just trying to do what was right." "Yeah, well, you did. That woman you saved, she deserved better than what I would have given her. Looks like she got it too." He nodded toward Flora, who stood with her hand on her heart, surrounded by her children. "That is a good life you built, better than anything I ever managed." "It is never too late to do the right thing," Frank said, "to be a better man." The foreman laughed bitterly. "Maybe not for you. For me, it is too late. But I wanted you to know, before I go, that what you did that day at the auction, it stuck with me, made me think about the kind of man I was, even if I did not have the strength to change it." He touched his hat. "Goodbye, cowboy. Take care of that family of yours." He rode away, and Flora came to stand beside Frank, slipping her hand into his. "That was unexpected." "Yes, it was. I almost feel sorry for him. He made his choices. We all do." Flora looked up at her husband, at the strong, kind man who had saved her life and given her everything she could have dreamed of. "And I will never regret mine." Frank smiled and kissed her, right there in front of the children, who made exaggerated sounds of disgust that turned into giggles. "Neither will I, love. Neither will I." As the sun set over the California hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Flora looked at her life and marveled at how far she had come. She had been sold like cattle at a fair, had been at her lowest point with no hope for the future, and then a cowboy had outbid every man and set her free. But Frank had given her more than freedom. He had given her love, partnership, family, and a life beyond anything she could have imagined. Their children grew up strong and happy on the ranch. James eventually took over the horse breeding operation, expanding it into one of the finest in the state. Sarah married a teacher and opened a school in Jamestown, educating generations of children. David became a rancher in his own right, buying land adjoining his parents' property. Emma and Elizabeth, inseparable as always, moved to San Francisco together and opened a dress shop that became wildly successful, their mother's skills and business sense living on in them. Frank and Flora watched their children grow and thrive with immense pride. They became grandparents, then great-grandparents, their house always full of family during holidays and celebrations. They grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year, weathering hardships and celebrating joys side by side. On quiet evenings, when the children and grandchildren had gone home, and it was just the two of them again, they would sit on the porch as they had done so many times before. Frank would hold Flora's hand, and they would watch the sunset over the hills, content in the life they had built together. "Do you ever wonder how different things would have been if I had not gone to that auction?" Frank asked one evening when they were both well into their 60s. "No," Flora said simply, "because I think we were always meant to find each other. Maybe not in that exact way, but somehow. We fit together too perfectly for it to be anything but fate. I do not believe in fate. You do not believe in a lot of things that are true anyway." She squeezed his hand. "You believe in love, though." You showed me that love could be honest and kind, that it could build rather than destroy. You showed me what it meant to be truly loved. You showed me that I could be more than the man I was in the war, that I could build something good and lasting. You gave me a family, Flora. You gave me everything. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars came out one by one, appearing like tiny diamonds scattered across black velvet. Inside the house, Flora could hear the ticking of the clock Frank had bought her on their 10th anniversary. The creak of floorboards settling in the cool evening air, all the small sounds of a well-loved home. "I have been thinking," Frank said eventually, "about what we should do with the ranch when we are gone. I know James wants to keep it in the family, but I want to make sure all the children benefit equally." "We can figure that out," Flora said. "We have time." As it turned out, they had another 15 good years together. Frank passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1891, at the age of 78. Flora held his hand through that last night, telling him stories of their life together, reminding him of their children and grandchildren, assuring him that she would be fine, that he could rest now. After Frank's funeral, Flora discovered he had left her a letter, written years before and updated periodically. In it, he told her again how much he loved her, how grateful he was for every day they had spent together, how she had saved him just as surely as he had saved her that day at the auction. He asked her to live fully in whatever time she had left, to not grieve too long, to remember that their love was not ended by death, but merely transformed. Flora did her best to honor his wishes. She lived another 12 years, spending her time with her children and grandchildren, continuing the charity work she and Frank had started, and writing down the story of their life together so that future generations would know how it had all begun. She passed away quietly in her sleep in the spring of 1903, at the age of 81, in the same bed she had shared with Frank for over 30 years. Her children found her with a smile on her face, and Frank's letter clutched in her hand. They buried her next to Frank on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a large oak tree they had planted together in the early years of their marriage. The headstone read simply, "Florence Zander, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother." But her children knew the fuller truth. She had been so much more than that. She had been a survivor, a fighter, a woman who had faced the worst humanity had to offer and chosen love anyway. The ranch stayed in the family for generations, each successive owner adding to the legacy Frank and Flora had built. The story of how they met became family legend, passed down from grandparents to grandchildren. A reminder that sometimes the darkest moments can lead to the greatest joys, that true love is worth fighting for, and that one act of courage and compassion can change not just one life, but generations to come. In the end, Flora's story was not about being sold like cattle at a fair, though that had happened. It was not about being rescued by a cowboy, though that too was true. It was about two people who found each other in the worst of circumstances and chose to build something beautiful together. It was about love that grew from respect and honesty into something deep and unshakable. It was about a family built on a foundation of kindness and hard work. It was about a life well lived, challenges overcome, and a love that literally lasted until death and beyond. The fairgrounds where Flora had once stood on an auction block were eventually torn down, replaced by proper buildings as Jamestown grew from a rough mining town into a proper community. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, people walking through that area would swear they could hear echoes of the past, the ghost of an auctioneer's voice, the sound of a gavel falling, and then, unexpectedly, the sound of paper tearing and a calm voice saying, "You are free to go wherever you please." And perhaps, in some way beyond understanding, that moment did echo forward through time, a reminder that there are still good people in the world, that love can bloom in the most unlikely places, and that one person's courage can set another person free in ways that go far beyond the merely physical. Frank and Flora's great-great-grandchildren still live on portions of the original ranch land. They raise horses as Frank did, and some of them sow as Flora did. They tell their children the story of how it all began, how their great-great-grandfather saw a woman in trouble and decided to help, even though it cost him everything he had saved, how that one act of compassion blossomed into love and family and a legacy that endures to this day. The story has become more than just family history. It is a reminder of what people can be at their best, of the power of choosing right over easy, of loving honestly and completely. It is a testament to the fact that our choices matter, that kindness is never wasted, and that sometimes the best things in life come from the moments when we decide to stand up for what is right, regardless of the cost. Flora's dress from her wedding day is preserved in the family museum, along with Frank's cavalry hat, the torn pieces of the indenture contract that he saved as a reminder, and dozens of letters they wrote to each other during their life together. These artifacts tell a story of ordinary people living extraordinary love, of a marriage built on mutual respect and genuine affection, of a partnership that weathered every storm life threw at it. And perhaps that is the real magic of their story. It was not about grand gestures or impossible obstacles overcome. It was about two people choosing each other every single day, in big ways and small, through good times and hard times, until death finally parted them. It was about building a life together one day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of love and kindness at a time. In the end, that is all any of us can do. Choose love over fear, choose kindness over cruelty. Choose to stand up for what is right even when it costs us something. Choose to build rather than destroy. Choose to give freely rather than take selfishly. Choose to see the humanity in others even when the world tells us to see only their utility or their threat. Frank Zander chose to see Florence Jenkins as a person worthy of dignity and freedom when the world saw her only as property to be bought and sold. Flora chose to see Frank as a good man worthy of her love when her past taught her to distrust all men. Together, they chose to build a life of meaning and purpose, leaving behind a legacy that continues to inspire everyone who hears their story. And that, ultimately, is the happily ever after they earned together. Not a life without struggle or pain or loss, but a life filled with love and purpose and family. A life that mattered. A life that made the world a little bit better for their having been in it. A life that proved, against all odds and all expectations, that love can triumph over even the darkest circumstances. Their story began with an auction block and a cowboy's defiant act of compassion. It continued through decades of partnership and parenting, of building and growing, of laughing and crying and living fully. And it ended, as all stories must, with death and remembrance. But the love they created, the family they built, and the legacy they left behind continue on, proof that what we do in this life matters, that love is real and powerful and worth fighting for, and that sometimes, just sometimes, we get the happy ending we never dared to hope for. Frank and Flora Zander lived, loved, and left the world better than they found it. And really, what more can any of us ask for than that?